The gruesome death of Louis XIV. Listener discretion is strongly advised for today's program. Picture the most powerful man in Europe reduced to a rotting corpse while still alive, his courtiers forced to smile and bow as the stench of decay fills the palace halls. This is not fiction. This is the documented death of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose final weeks in early September 1715 transformed Versailles into a charnel house of royal agony. The same monarch who built the grandest palace in Europe would spend his last days begging his doctors to end his suffering as gangrene consumed his body. We will examine why his physicians could not even preserve his corpse after death, turning his funeral into a biological nightmare. But to understand how completely Louis XIV fell, you must first see how high he once stood. The Sun King's golden years. At his zenith, Louis XIV commanded absolute authority over the most powerful nation in Europe. He ascended to the throne in 1643 at age 5, but by his 20s he had transformed France into the dominant continental force. He ruled for 72 years, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. During his prime, foreign ambassadors described him as godlike in appearance and manner. His presence filled rooms. When he spoke, kingdoms listened. Louis XIV understood that power was theater. He constructed Versailles not as a home but as a stage for absolute monarchy. The palace stretched across 700 rooms, each one designed to showcase French wealth and sophistication. Construction began in 1661 and consumed the labor of 36,000 workers. The Hall of Mirrors alone contained 357 mirrors, an almost impossible luxury when glass manufacturing remained primitive. Every surface gleamed with gold leaf. Marble statues lined corridors that seemed to extend forever. The gardens required 200,000 trees and flowering plants arranged in geometric perfection. The daily ritual of dressing the king became a ceremony of state. Nobles competed for the honor of handing him his shirt or holding his mirror. The lever, his morning rising, followed strict protocol. Only the highest-ranking duke present could offer the king his camise. Lesser nobles stood in assigned positions, watching in silence as Louis XIV transformed from man into monarch. These ceremonies served a calculated purpose. They kept the nobility busy with meaningless honors, while the king consolidated real power. Louis XIV weaponized luxury to control his subjects. He required the highest-ranking nobles to maintain residences at Versailles, effectively holding them hostage with hospitality. They competed to wear the most expensive clothing, bankrupting themselves to impress a king who noticed everything. He determined who could speak to him directly and who must communicate through intermediaries. Access to the royal presence became currency. A nod from Louis XIV could elevate a family. His indifference could destroy careers built over generations. His physical appearance became an instrument of statecraft. Louis XIV wore towering wigs that added a foot to his height, with heels embedded with diamonds and precious stones that elevated him another 4 inches. Silk stockings displayed legs that he considered among his finest features. He owned over 1,000 wigs, each styled for specific occasions, and suits worth more than most nobles earned in lifetimes. Jewels covered his fingers, his chest, even his shoe buckles. Every morning, teams of servants painted his face with cosmetics, whitening his skin and rouging his cheeks to create the illusion of eternal youth. The king projected strength through calculated displays of military might. He launched aggressive campaigns, claiming territories through inheritance rights and strategic expansion. His armies fought extended wars across multiple fronts, expanding French borders eastward and establishing dominance over rival European powers. He personally led troops into battle, his presence on battlefields serving as both inspiration and propaganda. Victory parades through Paris showcased captured enemy standards and prisoners of war. This magnificence came at a staggering cost. Versailles consumed between 2 and 3% of France's entire national income each year. The king's personal expenses exceeded the military budget. While courtiers dined on elaborate feasts featuring dozens of courses, peasants throughout France survived on bread and thin soup. Tax collectors stripped rural communities bare to fund royal extravagance. The contrast between Versailles and the countryside became a source of growing resentment that would eventually consume the monarchy itself. Louis XIV created a system where his own body became the symbol of French power. Foreign diplomats measured their nation's standing by how closely they could approach the royal person. Marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances all depended on physical audiences with the king himself. His health became a state secret, with court physicians required to take oaths of silence about any medical treatments. The entire structure of European diplomacy rested on the assumption that Louis XIV would remain the Sun King forever. The king's legendary vanity extended to obsessive control over his image. He commissioned hundreds of portraits, each one showing him an idealized form. Painters received specific instructions about how to render his features, emphasizing his strong jaw and bright eyes while minimizing signs of aging. He insisted that all official documentation describe him in terms of divine authority and physical perfection. Court publications never mentioned illness, weakness, or any human limitation that might undermine his carefully constructed mythology. Yet the very rituals that enshrined his divine authority would eventually trap his court into maintaining deadly illusions. The elaborate ceremonies designed to showcase royal perfection created a system where acknowledging the king's mortality became impossible. Courtiers who had spent decades competing for the privilege of witnessing his daily transformation into a living god could never admit that the performance was beginning to fail. The same theatrical machinery that had elevated Louis XIV above ordinary humanity would soon force everyone at Versailles to participate in a far more sinister charade. The first cracks in the facade. By the 1680s, the first cracks began appearing in the carefully maintained illusion of royal perfection. Louis XIV's body was already failing him decades before his death, though few in his court dared acknowledge what they witnessed daily. The man who had spent his entire reign controlling every detail of court life found himself unable to control the rebellion occurring within his own flesh. His digestive system became a source of constant torment. Louis XIV suffered from what court physicians described as violent intestinal spasms that would strike without warning. These episodes confined him to his private chambers for hours at a time, doubled over in agony while his stomach cramped and his bowels emptied uncontrollably. The king, who had turned every bodily function into a public ceremony, now found himself desperately hiding the most basic human needs. He would emerge from these attacks pale and sweating, yet still expected to maintain the facade that nothing had changed in the kingdom. The state of his teeth became a diplomatic hazard. Years of consuming sugar-heavy desserts and drinking sweet wines had rotted his teeth down to blackened stumps. His breath carried such a foul odor that foreign ambassadors reportedly learned to position themselves upwind during audiences. Court painters began depicting Louis XIV with his mouth closed, a stark contrast to earlier portraits that had emphasized his confident smile. The king's own courtiers developed the habit of breathing through their mouths when speaking with him directly. Hemorrhoids made standing an exercise in torture. The Sun King, who had once danced for hours at elaborate court ballets, now found even short ceremonial appearances almost unbearable. He began conducting more business from his bed, claiming this represented a new level of intimate access for his courtiers. In reality, the cushions provided the only relief from the constant burning and pressure that made sitting on hard chairs impossible. His physicians applied various ointments and treatments, but these medieval remedies often made the inflammation worse. The court developed an elaborate system to hide his physical decline. Servants applied increasingly thick layers of makeup to conceal the gray pallor that had replaced his once healthy complexion, while his clothing incorporated padding to maintain the illusion of strength. Palace staff learned to arrange lighting and stronger perfumes to mask both his deteriorating appearance and the medicinal odors that clung to his person. The king's health had become a state secret, with court physicians required to take oaths of silence about any medical treatments they administered. As pain consumed more of his energy, Louis XIV's personality underwent a noticeable transformation. The king, who had once enjoyed witty conversations and elaborate entertainment, became increasingly suspicious and controlling. He questioned the loyalty of longtime servants and demanded detailed reports about conversations that occurred in his absence. His famous temper, once reserved for matters of state, now erupted over minor protocol violations or perceived slights. Courtiers walked on eggshells, never knowing which version of their monarch they would encounter on any given day. What makes this period particularly disturbing is how everyone involved pretended that nothing fundamental had changed. Official court bulletins continued to describe the king's health in glowing terms. Foreign diplomats received carefully scripted updates about his vigor and mental sharpness. The same rituals continued with the same pomp, even as the central figure grew increasingly frail and desperate. The machinery of absolute monarchy had become so complex that it continued operating even when the monarch himself could barely function. The court adapted around his limitations with the same precision they had once applied to ceremony and protocol. Servants learned to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, positioning cushions and arranging seating to minimize his discomfort. They developed signals to communicate his condition without speaking directly about his health. Audiences were scheduled for times when his pain typically subsided, and backup plans ensured that official business could continue even when the king remained confined to his chambers. The chilling realization that haunts this period is how predictable the outcome had become. What started as digestive problems and dental issues had revealed a pattern of systemic breakdown that no amount of ceremony could reverse. The minor ailments that court physicians dismissed as temporary inconveniences were actually symptoms of a body beginning to consume itself. Then came the first signs of what would eventually kill him. Small ulcers appeared on his left leg, no larger than coins and easily hidden beneath his silk stockings. Court physicians dismissed them as minor irritations caused by tight clothing or small injuries from riding. They applied simple herb poultices and assured the king that the spots would heal within days. No one understood that they were witnessing the first symptoms of a condition that would transform the Sun King into something unrecognizable. These seemingly insignificant wounds would soon become the focal point of a medical nightmare that would consume the final months of his reign. When doctors became torturers, Louis XIV's court physicians represented the pinnacle of 17th century medical knowledge. Yet their contemporary orthodox remedies would, in practice, inflict extreme and often fatal harm on their royal patient. These doctors approached his deteriorating condition with techniques that had remained unchanged since medieval times, armed with centuries of accumulated medical ignorance that they mistook for wisdom. Each morning brought new procedures disguised as healing, transforming the royal chambers into scenes of systematic suffering. The daily routine of treating his leg ulcers followed established medical protocols that caused unimaginable agony. Physicians arrived at dawn carrying leather bags filled with crude instruments, the tools carrying contamination between patients, a reality unknown to doctors of the period. They lanced the infected wounds with knives, slicing through healthy tissue to drain pus that immediately refilled within hours. The king endured this cutting without anesthesia, gripping the arms of his chair while doctors probed deeper into wounds that refused to heal. Fresh blood mixed with infected discharge, creating new pathways for bacteria to spread throughout his system. Cauterization represented the most extreme aspect of his treatment regimen. Physicians heated iron rods in open flames until they glowed red hot, then pressed these burning instruments directly into the king's open ulcers. The procedure filled the royal apartments with smoke and the stench of burning human flesh. Louis XIV would bite down on leather straps to muffle his screams as doctors held the irons against his wounds for several seconds at a time. The theory behind this procedure was that intense heat would kill infection, but cauterization destroyed healthy tissue and created new wounds that became additional sources of contamination. The toxic remedies applied to his deteriorating leg represented a catalog of medieval chemistry. Court physicians mixed ash from burned animal bones with coarse salt and vinegar, creating acidic pastes that ate through tissue. They applied these mixtures twice daily, spreading them thick across open wounds where they bubbled and hissed as they dissolved living flesh. Other treatments included powders made from crushed pearls and gold, exotic ingredients that cost fortunes but provided no medical benefit, while adding additional irritants to already traumatized tissue. Bloodletting became a daily ritual that progressively weakened the king's ability to fight his condition. Physicians believed that illness resulted from imbalanced humors that could be corrected by draining excess blood from the body. They opened veins in his arms with lancets, allowing pints of blood to flow into brass bowls, while Louis XIV grew increasingly pale and weak. This procedure occurred every morning regardless of his condition, removing the very blood cells his immune system needed to combat the spreading infection. Each intervention created new complications that required increasingly extreme measures to address. The constant cutting and burning transformed his leg into a landscape of overlapping wounds that refused to close properly. Where one ulcer had existed, doctors created multiple new openings that leaked continuously. The cauterization left patches of dead, blackened skin that eventually sloughed off, exposing raw muscle and bone underneath. Every treatment session introduced new bacteria into his system, spreading the infection to previously healthy areas of his leg. Louis XIV's desperation grew as the pain became unbearable, and the treatments showed no signs of success. He began begging his physicians to try increasingly radical procedures, willing to endure any amount of suffering if it offered hope of relief. The king, who had once commanded armies, now pleaded with doctors to amputate his entire leg, believing that losing the limb was preferable to continuing the daily torture. Court protocol created a trap that prevented seeking competent medical help from outside sources. The royal physicians held their positions through political appointment rather than medical skill, and they jealously guarded their access to the king. They actively discouraged consultation with foreign doctors or experimental treatments that might expose their own incompetence. The rigid hierarchy that had made Louis XIV powerful now worked against him, as no one dared suggest that the court's medical establishment was systematically destroying their patient. The treatments had become a vicious cycle where each failed intervention justified more extreme measures. When cauterization failed to stop the infection, doctors concluded they had not burned deep enough and applied the hot irons for longer periods. When bloodletting failed to restore balance, they drained even more blood from his weakening body. The physicians convinced themselves that failure meant they needed to intensify their efforts rather than abandon techniques that were clearly making the situation worse. His physicians refused his desperate requests for amputation, fearing that such drastic surgery would kill him immediately. They failed to recognize that their current treatments were achieving the same result more slowly, while subjecting the Sun King to prolonged agony that would soon manifest in ways that no amount of royal protocol could conceal. The infection they had been fighting was about to cross a threshold that would transform the very air around the dying monarch. The stench that filled a palace. By August 1715, the gangrene had reached a stage where it announced itself throughout Versailles before visitors even entered the royal chambers. The sweet, cloying odor of rotting meat seeped through keyholes and under doors like an invisible poison, immediately triggering the gag reflex in anyone who encountered it. This was not the clean, antiseptic smell of a modern hospital, but the distinctive stench of advanced decay that the human nose recognizes instinctively as death. Palace staff initially attempted to combat the smell using traditional methods, but their efforts revealed the futility of fighting biological reality with ceremony. First came massive quantities of expensive incense imported from the Far East, filling braziers with aromatic woods and resins that had once been reserved for religious ceremonies. When that failed, servants sprayed increasingly powerful perfumes throughout the royal apartments every hour. Finally, they resorted to desperate measures. Vinegar-soaked cloths hung from every available surface, and herb sachets filled with lavender and rosemary scattered throughout the quarters and replaced multiple times daily. The combination created an atmosphere so thick and suffocating that breathing became difficult for everyone in the vicinity. The gangrene produced a smell that experienced palace servants began to recognize and dread. This odor possessed an almost supernatural ability to penetrate fabric, wood, and stone. It clung to the silk wall hangings in the royal bedchamber and absorbed into furniture crafted by master artisans. Even the marble surfaces seemed to retain traces of the corruption, making the very walls complicit in broadcasting the king's condition throughout the palace. Courtiers found themselves facing an impossible situation during formal audiences and ceremonies. Protocol demanded that they maintain perfect composure while standing mere feet from a source of smell so overwhelming that their bodies rebelled involuntarily. Many developed techniques for breathing through their mouths or positioning themselves to catch any available breeze. The physical reactions were immediate and uncontrollable. Faces would go pale, hands would tremble, and eyes would water as nobles fought to maintain their dignity while their stomachs churned violently. The smell functioned as an accurate barometer of Louis XIV's deteriorating condition, growing stronger and more complex as additional tissue died. Palace inhabitants learned to read these changes like weather patterns, understanding that particularly intense odors signaled new developments in the king's decline. When the smell carried hints of something resembling spoiled fish, experienced servants knew that fresh areas of flesh had begun to liquefy. When it took on metallic undertones, they recognized the signs of blood poisoning spreading through his system. Formal court ceremonies became exercises in endurance that tested the limits of human composure. During one particularly important diplomatic reception, the Venetian ambassador fainted halfway through his presentation, creating an international incident that required careful management to avoid insulting France's allies. Several prominent nobles were observed vomiting into handkerchiefs during formal dinners, though official records make no mention of these incidents. The situation became so desperate that servants began drawing lots to determine who would be assigned to tend the king directly. Many preferred accepting punishment for refusing orders rather than entering chambers where the smell had become so concentrated that exposure for more than a few minutes caused severe nausea and headaches. Those who drew the unfortunate assignments learned to prepare themselves by breathing through cloth soaked in strong spirits or by taking breaks every few minutes to recover in areas with fresher air. The odor's reach extended far beyond the royal quarters, making entire sections of Versailles uninhabitable for anyone with normal sensitivity to smell. Corridors that had once hosted elegant processions became passages that courtiers hurried through while holding their breath. Rooms adjacent to the king's chambers were abandoned entirely, as the smell penetrated through shared walls and made occupancy impossible. Even areas separated by multiple rooms and thick stone walls began to carry traces of the corruption, creating dead zones throughout the palace where normal court life could no longer function. What makes this period particularly disturbing is the realization that Versailles, built as the ultimate monument to French glory and Louis XIV's divine authority, had transformed into a monument to decay and death. The palace that had once drawn visitors from across Europe now served as a massive tomb for a king who remained technically alive but was already decomposing within its walls. Yet the stench represented only the beginning of the horror that was unfolding within the royal chambers. While courtiers struggled to maintain composure in the presence of overwhelming odors, the source of that smell was undergoing a transformation that defied everything they understood about the human body. What had begun as small ulcers on the Sun King's leg was about to reveal the true scope of gangrene's destructive power. A leg turns to liquid. The medical reality unfolding in the royal chambers defied everything physicians understood about the human body. Louis XIV's leg transformed from living flesh into something resembling meat left to rot in summer heat. What began as small coin-sized ulcers had spread like spilled ink across parchment, covering his entire leg from knee to ankle. The infection advanced with methodical precision, claiming new territory each day. The gangrene turned his skin black and glossy, resembling burned leather stretched too tight across swollen flesh. This was not the clean blackness of charcoal, but the mottled darkness of tissue that had died and begun to putrefy while still attached to living bone. Areas where blood flow had ceased completely took on an almost metallic sheen. The discoloration spread in irregular patches that merged and expanded, creating a map of destruction across what had once been the royal leg that danced at court ceremonies. The swelling became so grotesque that his leg doubled in size. The skin stretched beyond its natural limits, becoming thin and translucent in places where pressure from accumulated fluids and gas pushed against the surface. You could see the outline of bones beneath tissue that had become bloated and distorted. The normal contours of muscle and tendon disappeared under layers of infected fluid. When the pressure became too great, the skin simply split open along natural stress lines, creating gaping wounds that leaked continuously. These ruptures occurred without warning, suddenly releasing streams of infected discharge that soaked through bandages within minutes. The splits revealed layers of tissue underneath that had already begun to liquefy. Some openings revealed muscle that had turned gray and started to separate from bone, while others exposed tendons that had weakened to the point where they could be pulled apart with gentle pressure. Pieces of dead tissue began falling off his leg like bark peeling from a diseased tree. These chunks of flesh would separate during routine bandage changes, coming away in the hands of physicians who had no choice but to remove the putrid material. Some fragments were small, no larger than coins, while others came away in strips several inches long. The underlying tissue revealed by this process looked nothing like healthy human anatomy. Instead of pink muscle and white tendon, doctors found gray matter that had the consistency of overcooked meat. Daily bandage changes became exercises in horror that tested the resolve of even the most experienced court physicians. Each morning revealed new evidence of overnight decay, with chunks of flesh that had liquefied during sleep coming away with the old dressings. Physicians found themselves removing what had been solid tissue the previous day, now transformed into a substance that resembled spoiled pudding. The rate of decay accelerated as the infection spread. The king's physical agony reached levels that defied description as nerve endings died in some areas while remaining painfully active in others. Louis XIV experienced the unique torture of feeling his leg both burning with excruciating pain and going completely numb at the same time. He would scream from the agony in infected areas while simultaneously begging doctors to do something about regions of his leg that he could no longer feel. The absence of sensation terrified him more than the pain itself. During lucid periods, Louis XIV begged his physicians to amputate the entire leg, believing that losing the limb was preferable to watching it consume him piece by piece. His doctors refused these desperate requests, fearing that surgical amputation would kill him immediately through shock and blood loss. They failed to recognize that their current approach was achieving the same result through prolonged torture. The infection created pockets of pus that functioned like biological time bombs, building pressure until they burst without warning. These eruptions would soak through multiple layers of bandages within hours, requiring constant attention from servants who had to replace dressings several times each day. Each pocket that burst revealed new cavities in his leg where healthy tissue had been consumed and replaced with infected fluid. The gangrene poisoned his blood, sending toxins throughout his system that caused fever, delirium, and moments of clarity when he fully understood what was happening to his body. Even Louis XIV's legendary willpower, the force of personality that had dominated European politics for decades, proved completely inadequate against the biological reality of tissue death. His body had begun the process of decomposition while he remained alive to witness every stage of its progression. Once gangrene and internal toxins had advanced to this stage, 17th century medicine possessed no effective countermeasures to halt the decay. The infection creates its own environment for continued growth, spreading through blood vessels and tissue planes with mechanical inevitability that rendered human intervention essentially meaningless. What made this medical nightmare even more disturbing was that it was unfolding not in private, but before an audience of hundreds who were required by protocol to pretend that nothing extraordinary was happening. The court's deadly charade. The elaborate ceremonies continued with mechanical precision, transforming Versailles into the most surreal theater performance in European history. Every morning, French nobles dressed in their finest silk and velvet, applied perfume and powder, then proceeded to conduct state business while their monarch literally decomposed before their eyes. They discussed weather and gossip, signed trade agreements, and performed the same rituals that had defined court life for decades. The only difference was that their sovereign now resembled a living corpse more than a divine ruler. Courtiers developed an almost supernatural ability to ignore what their senses told them was happening. They would enter the royal chambers, breathe through their mouths to avoid the overwhelming smell, and engage in normal conversation while Louis XIV writhed in agony mere feet away. Diplomatic meetings continued on schedule. Marriage negotiations proceeded without interruption. The machinery of absolute monarchy had become so complex that it continued operating even when its central component was falling apart. Court protocol transformed this nightmare into a legal requirement that trapped everyone in collective delusion. Acknowledging the king's real condition could be punished as treason, so silence became mandatory under French law. No one could suggest that Louis XIV was dying or even seriously ill. Official conversations had to proceed as if nothing had changed in the kingdom. This legal framework prevented anyone from breaking character in this macabre performance, as the same rigid hierarchy that had made Louis XIV powerful now made telling the truth a criminal offense. The psychological strain on palace inhabitants reached breaking points that threatened their sanity. Servants who had worked at Versailles for decades began experiencing nightmares about the smell following them home. Nobles developed nervous twitches and digestive problems from the constant stress of maintaining composure while fighting nausea. Some courtiers started drinking heavily to dull their senses enough to function normally during required appearances. Others developed elaborate mental tricks to disconnect from what they were witnessing, treating each day like an acting performance where they played people who noticed nothing unusual. The charade nearly collapsed during an important ceremony marking a saint's feast day, when 3 different nobles fled the chapel mid-service, claiming sudden illness while clearly struggling not to vomit. The incident created whispered conversations throughout the palace about whether the performance could continue indefinitely. Palace servants began collapsing during their duties, overcome by the toxic atmosphere that had replaced the elegant environment they had once maintained with pride. Official court bulletins became exercises in creative fiction that bore no relationship to observable reality. These daily reports described Louis XIV as alert and engaged in state business, while he spent hours screaming in agony and begging doctors to end his suffering. Diplomatic correspondence assured foreign governments that the French king remained in excellent health and full control of his mental faculties. These documents were distributed throughout Europe, while anyone who visited Versailles could see that the Sun King had become a figure of horror. Maintaining appearances required elaborate staging that consumed enormous resources and planning. Palace staff positioned the king's body at angles that hid the worst visible decay from visitors. They arranged lighting to cast shadows across areas where his leg had become obviously deformed. Servants learned to change his bedding and clothing in ways that minimized exposure to the infected areas, while diplomatic audiences were scheduled for times when his condition appeared most stable. Every public appearance became a carefully choreographed deception designed to preserve the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed. The courtiers' fear of punishment kept them participating in this theater of the absurd, even as their own health suffered from prolonged exposure to the toxic environment. They understood that acknowledging reality meant facing imprisonment or exile from the only world they had ever known. Their entire social identity depended on their position at court, making them willing to endure physical illness and psychological trauma rather than risk losing their status. They had become prisoners of a system that demanded they witness horror while pretending to see glory. The rigid hierarchy that had been Louis XIV's greatest source of power now worked against everyone involved by preventing rational responses to an obvious crisis. No one possessed the authority to seek outside medical help without admitting that the current situation was inadequate. No one could suggest alternative treatments without implying that the royal physicians were incompetent. No one could even recommend that the king rest or cancel appointments without acknowledging that he was too ill to perform his duties. Foreign diplomats who witnessed these scenes returned to their home countries with private reports that described Versailles as a place where rational thought had been suspended in favor of maintaining impossible fictions. Some began avoiding French court entirely, sending lower-ranking representatives who could be replaced if they became ill from exposure to the toxic environment. The palace that had once been the envy of Europe was becoming known throughout diplomatic circles as a place where sanity went to die. What makes this period particularly disturbing is the realization that hundreds of intelligent, educated people had become complicit in a performance that prioritized royal dignity over basic human compassion. They watched a man suffer in ways that would have horrified them under normal circumstances, yet they continued their charade while the king himself began to crack under pressures that no amount of absolute power could withstand. When the Sun King begged for death, by late August, the psychological collapse had begun in earnest. The most heartbreaking moment in Louis XIV's decline came when the man who had spent his entire life demanding absolute control over everything around him began pleading with God and his doctors to end his suffering. The king, who had once declared that he was the state itself, was reduced to begging for the mercy of death. During fever-soaked nights, his voice could be heard throughout the royal quarters, crying out to the Virgin Mary to take his soul before dawn broke over Versailles. These desperate prayers echoed through chambers that had once hosted elegant conversations and diplomatic negotiations, now transformed into scenes from a medieval vision of hell. His mental deterioration became as disturbing as his physical decay, as pain and infection ravaged his mind along with his body. The gangrene had poisoned his blood so thoroughly that toxins affected his brain function, causing hallucinations that terrified both the king and his attendants. Louis XIV began seeing enemies lurking in shadows throughout his chambers, pointing at corners where he claimed assassins waited to strike. He accused his physicians of trying to poison him, refusing treatments and demanding that all food and medicine be tested by multiple servants before he would consume anything. The paranoia revealed how completely his legendary authority had crumbled under the assault of biological reality. The king alternated between lucid moments when he accepted his approaching death with dignity and delirious episodes where he seemed to forget entirely what was happening to him. During clear periods, he would discuss funeral arrangements and give final instructions to his advisors with the same attention to detail that had characterized his entire reign. He spoke to his 5-year-old heir about the burdens of kingship, warning against the vanity and endless wars that had consumed his own reign. But these rational intervals became shorter and less frequent as the infection spread. More often, courtiers witnessed him reliving past glories, shouting orders to long-dead generals, or conducting imaginary audiences with foreign ambassadors who had died decades earlier. Even as his body betrayed him completely, Louis XIV made heartbreaking attempts to maintain royal dignity and continue conducting state business from his bed. He insisted on reviewing documents while lying in sheets soaked with discharge from his infected leg. Foreign ambassadors were still required to present their credentials to a king whose bandages leaked continuously onto silk pillows embroidered with the royal coat of arms. He would try to sit up straight during these audiences, his face contorting with pain as he struggled to project the authority that had once come so naturally. These performances became increasingly difficult to watch, as everyone involved understood they were witnessing the final acts of a man who refused to acknowledge his own mortality. The specific moments when his iron will cracked completely provided the most disturbing glimpses into his desperation. Palace records document occasions when Louis XIV begged his attendants to cut off his infected leg entirely, promising them rewards and titles if they would end his agony through amputation. He pleaded with his physicians to give him something that would end the pain permanently, though he stopped short of explicitly asking for poison. During his worst episodes, he would grab the clothing of anyone who came near his bed, pulling them close while whispering desperate requests for help that no 17th century medicine could provide. His fear of assassination grew into full paranoia as his mind failed under the assault of constant pain and blood poisoning. The king, who had once trusted his physicians implicitly, now refused treatments, convinced that every medicine contained poison meant to hasten his death. He demanded that servants taste his food and drink before allowing anything to touch his lips. This paranoia created additional challenges for his already inadequate medical care, as treatments were delayed or refused entirely based on his delusional fears of conspiracy. The tragic irony of his situation became clear to everyone who witnessed his decline. Here was a man who had lived as an absolute monarch, controlling the lives and deaths of millions of subjects, now completely helpless and dependent on servants for the most basic human needs. Louis XIV could not feed himself, clean himself, or even change position in bed without assistance. The hands that had once signed death warrants now shook too violently to hold a pen. The voice that had commanded armies could barely whisper requests for water. Every aspect of his existence required the intervention of others, reversing the power dynamic that had defined his entire adult life. Even his closest advisors began to abandon him as the horror of his condition became unbearable to witness. Men who had served the crown for decades found excuses to avoid the royal chambers, claiming urgent business elsewhere when summoned to attend the dying king. The smell, the sounds of his agony, and the visible evidence of his decay proved too much for courtiers who had once competed for access to the royal presence. They could not reconcile the godlike figure they had feared and revered with the broken creature begging for death in silk sheets stained with bodily fluids. By the final days of August, The episodes of clarity had become brief flickers in an ocean of delirium. The infection had seized control of both his body and mind, leaving only fragments of the Sun King, who had once commanded Europe's respect and fear. The final breath of absolute power. On the morning of September 1st, 1715, at exactly 8:15, Louis XIV simply stopped breathing. There was no dramatic final speech, no last words of wisdom for the ages. The longest reign in French history ended with a quiet exhale that barely registered among the physicians and servants who had grown accustomed to his labored breathing. The Sun King died as he had lived his final weeks, surrounded by the stench of his own decay, his infected legs still leaking fluids onto silk sheets that had once been symbols of royal luxury. Versailles fell into an eerie silence as the elaborate machinery of absolute monarchy suddenly lost its most essential component. The immediate problem was what to do with a body that continued decomposing at an alarming rate even after death, posing immediate dangers to everyone in the room. The gangrene had spread so extensively that Louis XIV's corpse remained toxic and dangerous to anyone who came near. The infection had consumed so much tissue that his leg was barely attached to the rest of his body. Palace physicians warned that the gases being released by the ongoing decay could cause serious illness in anyone who spent time in the royal chambers. Palace staff had to devise methods for handling the body that would prevent the spread of disease while maintaining some semblance of royal dignity. They wrapped the corpse in multiple layers of cloth soaked in preservatives, but the fluid seeping from his infected leg quickly saturated these materials. Moving the body required careful planning and protective measures that no one at Versailles had ever needed to consider for a royal death. Courtiers who had defined their entire existence around serving their monarch now faced an existential crisis that threatened their sanity. Many had spent decades at Versailles following the rigid protocols that governed every interaction with the king. Their social status, their income, their very identity depended on their relationship to Louis XIV. Without him, they were simply middle-aged men and women dressed in expensive clothing with no clear role in the world. Some wandered the palace halls in a daze, continuing to perform duties that no longer had any meaning. Others packed their belongings and fled to their country estates, unable to face the reality of what Versailles had become. The smell that had tormented the palace during his final weeks intensified after death, making entire sections of Versailles uninhabitable for anyone with normal human senses. Servants who had endured weeks of exposure to the toxic atmosphere finally abandoned their posts, unable to continue working in conditions that threatened their own health. The royal chambers became a quarantine zone where only the most desperate or duty-bound attendants dared to venture. News of the Sun King's death spread across Europe within days, triggering immediate calculations among rival nations about how French weakness might be exploited. England began planning military campaigns to reclaim territories lost during Louis XIV's wars. Spain prepared to challenge French influence in Italy and the Netherlands. The Holy Roman Empire saw opportunities to reverse decades of French territorial gains. The delicate balance of power that Louis XIV had maintained through strength and diplomatic cunning began shifting the moment his death became known to foreign courts. The heir to all this chaos was a 5-year-old child who inherited not the glorious kingdom his great-grandfather had promised, but a nation bankrupted by decades of expensive wars and extravagant spending. Louis XV would rule over a country where the royal treasury contained insufficient funds to maintain basic government operations. The debt accumulated during his predecessor's reign exceeded the kingdom's ability to generate revenue through taxation. Provincial administrators had not been paid in months. Military units lacked supplies and equipment necessary for basic defense. The new king inherited a legacy of financial disaster disguised as imperial grandeur. The elaborate court system that had been Louis XIV's greatest tool for controlling the nobility immediately began collapsing without its central organizing figure. Courtiers who had competed for access to the royal presence found themselves with no one to serve and no clear hierarchy to navigate. The ceremonies that had occupied their days lost all meaning when performed for a dead king. palace positions that had been coveted sources of income and status became meaningless titles with no associated duties or benefits. The social structure of Versailles dissolved within days of Louis XIV's death. Consider the ultimate irony of what Louis XIV had achieved through his obsession with absolute power and personal glory. The man who had declared that the state existed only through his person left behind a government so dependent on his individual will that it could barely function after his death. His famous statement that he was the state had proven terrifyingly accurate. Without Louis XIV, France faced political paralysis and administrative chaos that would take years to resolve under a regency government ruling for a child king. The profound irony that haunts Louis XIV's legacy is how his death contradicted everything he had tried to accomplish during his lifetime. He built Versailles to ensure his immortality and demonstrate the eternal power of French monarchy. Instead, his degrading death became a symbol throughout Europe of monarchy's ultimate weakness against basic biological reality. The Sun King, who had tried to transform himself into a god, died in such a disgusting manner that his death became a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition. Yet even death would not end the horror surrounding Louis XIV's remains. What happened when the royal surgeons opened his body would horrify even seasoned embalmers. The botched embalming horror. Royal surgeons arrived expecting to perform the elaborate embalming process that had been perfected for generations of French monarchs. What they discovered was not a body suitable for preservation, but a medical nightmare that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. These physicians, who had prepared the bodies of kings and queens for decades, found themselves facing a corpse so corrupted that their established techniques were completely useless. The first incision revealed the scope of the horror awaiting them. Instead of the normal resistance of healthy tissue, their knives sliced through skin and muscle that had the consistency of overripe fruit. When they opened the body cavity, the smell that emerged was so overwhelming that several assistants immediately fled the room, leaving the primary surgeons to continue their work while fighting waves of nausea. The abdomen had swollen to twice its normal size from gases produced by internal decay, making the corpse appear grotesquely bloated. What the embalmers found inside challenged everything they understood about human anatomy. His internal organs had liquefied to such an extent that distinguishing between different structures became impossible. The intestines had dissolved into a soup-like substance that flowed freely throughout the abdominal cavity. His stomach lining had completely collapsed, leaving only fragments of tissue floating in infected fluid. The liver had turned black and begun separating into chunks that came apart when touched with surgical instruments. The breaking point came when one of the most experienced surgeons vomited directly onto the corpse during the procedure. He had been attempting to remove what remained of the king's spleen when the organ simply disintegrated in his hands, releasing a burst of putrid gas that overwhelmed his ability to continue working. The surgeon staggered away from the table and never returned, leaving his colleagues to attempt the impossible task of preserving tissues that had already begun returning to their component elements. Desperate to salvage some semblance of dignity from the procedure, the remaining embalmers began stuffing the body cavity with perfumed cloth and preservative substances in a vain, last-ditch attempt to contain the decay. They packed aromatic herbs, salt, and expensive spices into the hollowed abdomen, hoping these materials would slow the corruption and mask the smell that continued to emanate from the body. Their efforts proved futile. The preservatives were quickly saturated with infected fluids that leaked from tissues throughout the corpse, becoming vehicles for spreading the corruption rather than containing it. The corpse swelled visibly during the embalming process, expanding until the specially crafted coffin that had been measured to fit Louis XIV's body could no longer accommodate his remains. Palace carpenters had to be summoned mid-procedure to widen the casket, working alongside embalmers who continued their increasingly hopeless task. The late summer heat of September accelerated the decomposition beyond anything the embalmers had encountered in their professional careers, despite working in chambers cooled with ice and ventilated with fans. Traditional embalming techniques had been developed for bodies that died from normal causes, leaving internal structures intact. The methods that had successfully preserved French royalty for centuries were completely inadequate for a corpse destroyed by gangrene. The usual process of draining blood and replacing it with preservative fluids was impossible when the circulatory system had been compromised by months of infection. The standard procedure of removing and separately preserving internal organs became meaningless when those organs had already liquefied beyond recognition. The horrific smell that had plagued Versailles during the king's final weeks intensified exponentially once his body was opened for embalming. The concentrated odor of decay, infection, and preservative chemicals created an atmosphere so toxic that workers could only remain in the room for brief periods before requiring breaks to recover. Servants burned constantly refreshed incense and aromatic woods, but these measures provided no meaningful relief from the stench that seemed to penetrate stone walls and wooden furniture with supernatural persistence. Even in death, Louis XIV's body refused to cooperate with the elaborate rituals designed to maintain royal dignity and demonstrate the eternal nature of monarchical power. The same flesh that had been carefully maintained as a symbol of divine authority during his lifetime now actively resisted every attempt at preservation. Each procedure intended to prepare the corpse for public viewing instead revealed new evidence of decay that made such display impossible. The body that had served as the foundation of absolute monarchy had become a source of revulsion that threatened to undermine the very concepts it had once represented. Palace physicians warned that the Sun King's corpse had become a genuine public health hazard, with prolonged exposure to the gases and fluids emanating from the body posing serious risks to the living. Officials considered the remains so dangerous that they abandoned traditional funeral protocols and expedited burial procedures to prevent contamination. This forced them to rush the entire funeral process, sealing away the corrupted remains as quickly as possible while still maintaining some semblance of royal ceremony. Yet even these desperate measures could not prevent the final humiliation that awaited the Sun King's legacy, as his corrupted body would soon become the centerpiece of the most macabre royal spectacle in French history: a funeral procession of decay. The funeral procession from Versailles to Saint-Denis became the most macabre spectacle in French royal history, where mourners struggled to maintain proper grief while fighting waves of nausea caused by their decomposing monarch. Thousands of people lined the route expecting to witness a solemn ceremony honoring their greatest king, only to discover that the central figure of this pageantry was a biological horror that challenged their ability to remain upright. The elaborate funeral cortege, designed to showcase the eternal majesty of French monarchy, instead became a procession of decay that left participants gasping for clean air. The smell that had tormented Versailles during Louis XIV's final weeks now followed his corpse through the French countryside like an invisible plague. Despite being sealed inside a lead-lined coffin that had been reinforced to contain the corruption, the stench of his decomposing body managed to escape and spread throughout the funeral procession. Horses pulling the funeral carriage showed signs of distress, tossing their heads and fighting their handlers as they encountered odors that triggered their instinctive fear of death and decay. Even the specially trained royal horses accustomed to ceremonial duties balked at approaching the hearse that carried their former master. Word about the condition of the corpse spread rapidly among the crowds gathered to witness this historic funeral. People who had traveled from distant provinces to pay their respects to the Sun King found themselves keeping substantial distances from the procession route once they understood what they were actually witnessing. Mothers pulled children away from the roadside, covering their faces with handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or perfume. Elderly spectators, many of whom had lived their entire lives under Louis XIV's reign, turned away in horror from what their beloved monarch had become. The elaborate funeral ceremonies that had been planned for months proved completely inadequate for masking the biological reality of what the Sun King had transformed into during his final decay. Cathedral ceremonies that should have focused on prayers and royal eulogies instead became exercises in endurance, as clergy and congregation fought to maintain their composure while breathing air contaminated by the smell of putrefaction. The incense burned during religious services mixed with the odor of corruption to create an atmosphere that many participants described as hellish rather than heavenly. Pallbearers faced challenges that no previous royal funeral had presented, forced to maintain solemn dignity while carrying a coffin that emanated toxic gases through its seals. These men, chosen for their strength and ceremonial experience, had to breathe through handkerchiefs soaked in strong spirits to avoid vomiting during their duties. Several pallbearers requested replacement during the procession, claiming sudden illness while clearly struggling not to collapse from the overwhelming stench. The normally precise choreography of royal funeral ceremonies became irregular as participants stumbled or paused to recover their composure. The public viewing at Versailles transformed into an ordeal that tested human endurance more than it honored royal memory. Visitors who came expecting to see Louis XIV lying in state discovered instead that approaching his coffin required navigating clouds of toxic air that immediately triggered gag reflexes. Many mourners entered the viewing chamber only to flee within seconds, unable to tolerate the concentrated smell of decay that filled the space despite constant burning of aromatic substances. Funeral directors implemented desperate measures that revealed the unprecedented nature of this royal burial. They burned extra incense at 3 times the normal rate, filling the air with so much smoke that visibility became limited throughout the ceremonial spaces. Servants scattered vinegar-soaked herbs along the entire funeral route, creating acidic clouds that provided no real relief but demonstrated their willingness to try anything that might mask the corruption. Viewing times were shortened from the traditional hours-long observances to brief minutes, acknowledging that longer exposure posed health risks to the living. Diplomatic representatives from foreign courts cut their participation short, creating international incidents as they fled ceremonies that had been designed to demonstrate French power and dignity. The pageantry that should have reinforced monarchical authority instead provided evidence of monarchy's ultimate powerlessness against natural decay. Clergy abbreviated religious services, recognizing that prolonged exposure to the toxic environment posed dangers to their congregations. The relief felt by everyone involved when Louis XIV's corrupted remains were finally sealed away in his tomb marked the end of France's nightmare. Palace officials, clergy, funeral directors, and ordinary citizens all experienced the same sensation of liberation when the source of corruption was finally contained underground, where it could no longer contaminate the world of the living. The Sun King's burial brought closure not just to his reign, but to a period of collective horror that had tested the sanity of everyone who witnessed the transformation of divine majesty into putrid decay. Yet the horror of Louis XIV's death would prove to be only the beginning of its impact on European civilization. The contrast between his glorious reign and his grotesque end had created a powerful symbol that would reshape how people thought about absolute power itself. The legacy of royal rote. The horror stories from Versailles spread through diplomatic correspondence and private letters, providing European intellectuals with a powerful symbol of monarchy's fundamental mortality. Enlightenment philosophers seized on these accounts of Louis XIV's grotesque death as evidence that divine right was nothing more than elaborate fiction. Here was a king who had claimed godlike authority, built the most magnificent palace in Europe, and conquered territories across the continent, yet he died screaming in agony while his own body consumed itself. The stench that filled Versailles, the gangrene that liquefied his flesh, and the desperate begging for death all demonstrated that no crown could protect against the universal experience of human decay. Writers across Europe began using his degrading death as proof that any political system based on one person's supposed divine nature was inherently flawed, when that person could be reduced to rotting meat by simple bacterial infection. The graphic details circulated through intellectual salons and court circles, creating a new understanding of royal mortality that previous generations had been taught to ignore. How could someone claim divine right when their own body betrayed them so completely? How could subjects worship a king whose presence made them physically ill from the smell of his decay? The 5-year-old who inherited this nightmare faced challenges that would have overwhelmed experienced rulers. Louis XV became king of a nation so financially devastated by his predecessor's spending that the royal treasury could barely fund basic government operations. The wars Louis XIV had fought to expand French territory had consumed resources that France would need decades to recover. Versailles alone had cost between 2 and 3% of the nation's entire income for over 50 years, creating crushing debt that accumulated interest faster than new revenue could be generated. The new king inherited a government structure so dependent on personal royal authority that it could barely function under a regency. Louis XIV had centralized all decision-making around his individual will, leaving behind administrative systems that required constant royal input for even minor matters. Provincial governors waited for instructions from Versailles before implementing policies. Military commanders needed royal approval for troop movements and strategic decisions. The entire machinery of French government had been designed around one person's daily involvement, making it nearly paralyzed when that person no longer existed. European powers immediately sensed French weakness and began challenging the balance of power that Louis XIV had maintained through strength and diplomatic skill. England started planning military campaigns to reclaim territories lost during previous wars with France. Spain prepared to contest French influence in Italy and the Netherlands. The Holy Roman Empire saw opportunities to reverse decades of French territorial gains. Austria began mobilizing resources for conflicts that had been impossible, while Louis XIV commanded respect through military superiority. The immediate political consequences extended beyond military threats to include diplomatic isolation and economic disruption. Foreign courts that had once treated France as the dominant European power now began ignoring French interests in their calculations. Trade agreements were renegotiated to remove advantages that Louis XIV had secured through political pressure. Marriage alliances that had strengthened French influence were abandoned as other nations sought more profitable partnerships. The cultural dominance that French court had exercised over European fashion, art, and social customs began declining as Versailles lost its position as the center of continental civilization. The psychological impact on the French nobility proved equally destabilizing. Courtiers who had defined their entire identity around serving an absolute monarch found themselves questioning the fundamental assumptions of their social system. If the Sun King could be reduced to putrid flesh that horrified everyone who encountered it, what did that say about the nature of royal authority? Many nobles began retreating to their country estates, abandoning Versailles for the first time in decades. Others started questioning whether the elaborate ceremonies and rigid protocols that had governed their lives served any meaningful purpose. The financial crisis inherited from Louis XIV's reign would plague France for the remainder of the 18th century, contributing directly to the revolutionary movements that eventually destroyed the monarchy entirely. The debt he accumulated through wars and construction projects created ongoing budget deficits that forced his successors to implement increasingly desperate taxation policies. These financial pressures generated resentment among both nobles and common people who saw their resources consumed by obligations created during the previous reign. The same extravagance that had demonstrated French power during Louis XIV's golden years became evidence of royal irresponsibility that undermined monarchical legitimacy. The lasting significance of Louis XIV's grotesque death lies in how it exposed the biological reality that absolute monarchy tried to deny. No amount of ceremony, wealth, or political authority could overcome the basic fact that kings were human beings subject to disease, decay, and death like everyone else. The Sun King's corpse had become both a literal decomposition and a symbol of power's ultimate limitations against the forces that govern all human existence. Conclusion: the collapse of Louis XIV's divine mythology had consequences that extended far beyond his personal suffering. His death represents the ultimate failure of absolute power to overcome basic human mortality. The man who declared himself the sun died in darkness, consumed by the same biological processes that claim every human regardless of their earthly status. A 72-year reign ended in a corpse so corrupted that embalmers could not preserve it, proving that no amount of gold, ceremony, or political authority could protect him from the bacteria that destroyed his body piece by piece. Death remains the great equalizer, and no crown or palace can shield us from the democracy of decay that awaits us all. If you appreciated this deep dive into one of history's most grotesque royal deaths, please like and subscribe to support more episodes like this one. What surprised you most about the Sun King's end?